It's from him. Giving credit where credit is due. Now we're going to go back to my notes. Now we're going to discuss, we've talked about how God is the creator and his creation is his, and we are assigned the task to represent God by managing it on behalf of God as his stewards. Now, one of those concerns or issues of the day is climate change. So we're going to discuss that. So we're going to move on in our outline from the excerpt to capital letter A, climate change. So climate change, theologically, we believe that God providentially controls, conserves, and constrains all things, including the climate. Human sin and corruption has spread in and through the world. That's true. We live in a fallen world, but we believe that God is continually controlling, conserving, and that God is constraining all things in the universe, in the world. And so we believe in God's providence, his provision, and his protection. And so we need to recognize that when we're theorizing, when we're thinking about climate change. So climate change, the scriptures, turn with me to Genesis chapter 8, verse 22. Genesis chapter 8, verse 22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So God is saying that he is in control and this will not cease. So this includes the weather patterns. I mean, it explicitly cites the weather patterns. So God is in control of the weather. God is in control of the climate. And so, as I stated, God is providentially in control of all things. So now we're going to discuss specifically climate change. And before I do, I want to talk a little bit about some of, it's not in your notes, but I do think it's important that we understand some of the material on this. So first, on your outline, we're moving from capital letter A. We did number 1, now we're doing number 2. There's cultural alarm. Climate change is scientifically and politically publicized as a dire threat. There are a lot of social and economic pressures to advance climate change and green energy. Right? That should be indisputable. Many of us have heard in the news, or we've heard the politics on this, especially given the legislation that is before our public representatives. So there's great enthusiasm talking about climate change, and it causes alarm. So what I want to do is first I want to talk about, I am not a scientist, I am not a climatologist, I am a Christian philosopher theologian. That is what I am. So when I'm weighing into these fields, I'm not a scientist. I'm familiar with philosophy of science, so I need to make that caveat and that disclaimer. But what I need to inform you of is that what I just said is true even within the church. Okay? There are different evangelical groups that you need to be aware of. So the first one is called the Evangelical Environmental Network. I guess I'll put network right here. So this was, as far as I understand, this particular nonprofit, as far as I know they're nonprofit, this organization was founded in the 90s, and it was founded by, if we're talking about politics, a very left-wing progressive when it comes to political agendas, okay? So it's founded by them. The current CEO is Jessica Moorman. It's Moerman. It's Moerman. I don't know how to pronounce that. So Moerman. I'm not sure. It makes me want to say Mormon, but I don't know. Mormon. And then Catherine Hayhoe is one of the speakers for this particular group. Now, the reason why I bring up this group is it's important because this group is connected with George Soros in some way, shape, or form, and they received funding from the Clinton's Global Initiative. When you think Clinton, think of Clinton, Bill and Hillary, okay? So they received funding from them. They received funding from the Hewlett Foundation, who, as far as I understand, they fund a lot of like Planned Parenthood and some of these other organizations that we would look down upon. So they're getting money in some way, shape, or form, and they're trying to infiltrate the church and have the church teach climate change. Okay, so they're trying to influence the church. Okay, so what is this particular organization's goal? So this particular organization's goal is quite clear. They're not merely trying to. And for those that are just joining, I'll just let you know we are on page 3. We're on page 3, and we're on capital letter A, and we're on number 2. So we're talking about climate change. Okay, this is part of environmental ethics. And what I mentioned is this particular organization, I need to bring up, it's not in your notes, but this particular organization, EEN, they're trying to influence the Christian church. Okay, they want to get climate change, specific teaching on global warming into the church, and what their ultimate goal is to influence political legislation. Okay, that's quite clear in their Evangelical Climate Initiative, that they had an ad in the New York Times. Okay, the Environmental Climate Initiative had some names that some of you guys in this room are pretty well known. So, have you guys ever heard of Rick Warren? Okay, so Rick Warren signed that, and some other pretty well-known people from some of the different networks. But also, have you guys heard of Christianity Today? So, Christianity Today, one of the editors signed it. Have you guys heard of National Association of Evangelicals? This is another big organization that the Evangelical Environmental Network has attempted to influence Christianity Today and National Association of Evangelicals. Because their goal, and like I said, is they want to influence the Christian church to have, influence political legislation. They want Christians to vote for climate change initiatives. Okay? So you need to understand this background, okay? Because we talked about the philosophy of science last week and how there's more to science than just observational data and experiments. There is also social, economic, professional influences on science and how science is conducted. And here's a pretty good example where you have this money from the Clinton's Global Initiative and the Hewlett Foundation helping funding the Evangelical Environmental Network, and they're pushing agendas to influence the church, specifically in favor of climate change, and to teach that in the church. And if I can, not necessarily to get political, but they're pushing a left-wing understanding of climate change. Okay?
Give an example.
Of it, like, what are they pushing?
Yeah.
So what are they pushing? They're pushing, so they're trying to get specific people to be taught in seminaries to affect their understanding. So a concrete example, Southeastern Seminary, they had Daniel L. Is it Akin? A-K-I-N? I think it's Daniel L. Akin. The president of Southern Eastern Seminary, which is one of our Southern Baptist seminaries. So they're trying to influence him. So what did they do? They influenced him, and then he brought people that are pro a pro-specific understanding of climate change to come to the seminary and teach, and to give a symposium to influence the seminary students. And one of those particular individuals that came was Jonathan Moo. And Jonathan Moo, what did he teach? He said what we should do is we should contribute to OKIOS, which is, he's a board member of that particular organization, and he says that we should buy, they call it, green credits. So in order to counter the environment, what you need to do is pay them money through buying credits to try and erase your carbon footprint. Okay? Yeah. Yes?
Is the Gospel Coalition also part of the, you mentioned Christianity Today.
I haven't read anything about, no, I haven't read anything about them. Now, where am I getting all this from? Research. But also, in your notes, if you want to look deeper into this, I'd recommend, if you want something really short and brief, you can look at Megan, is it Basham? It's in your footnote. I'll tell you right now. It is on page 2. It's footnote number 2. Megan Basham, Shepherds for Sale. Read pages 42 to 96 in that book. Buy the book and read it. She goes through it. That's quite a recent book, but she does a pretty good job summarizing some of the economic influences when it comes to climate change trying to influence the church. Okay? Now that we've discussed that, and so I talked about these left-wing leaning understanding of climate change. Well, what about, isn't there like a moderate and, more centered view of this? And isn't there a right-wing, right? Because in terms of politics, it's not a very good characterization, but yes, there are. So what I've done in your notes is I'm going to do an assessment, but for kind of a different take, more of a moderate view, you can look at Hugh Ross. Hugh Ross's work, and he has a particular think tank called Reasons to Believe. So it's reasons.org. Okay. Now Hugh Ross, he is an old Earth creationist, but he believes in a historic Adam. He denies evolution. Okay. But he takes a moderate take on climate change. He's more of a moderate. I would not consider him like the evangelical environmental network that I talked about. Okay, and then more a skeptical view of climate change is going to be E. Calvin Beisner. And his particular think tank is called Cornwall Alliance. And then there's another one that's called Heartland Institute. Okay? Now what do these guys say? These guys they're questioning the magnitude, rate, and risks of climate change. Okay? And it's kind of a funny story. I know about Calvin Beisner because he used to do stuff with Walter Martin. If any of you guys, some of you from the past know about Walter Martin.
Mormonism.
Yeah, Walter Martin, he was an apologist to Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, all the cults, okay? So Dr. Beisner, I'm familiar with his work, and I'm familiar with Hugh Ross as well. All right, so I bring all this up just to kind of give you a lay of the land. Now we're going to focus on my notes. None of this is in my notes. If you're interested, I can give you guys a copy of some of this material that I collected. But, yeah, and there's even more. It's interesting. Okay. All right, so our focus is environmental ethics, and we're talking about climate change, because this is one of the topics that we have to discuss when it comes to environmental ethics. In my philosophy of science class 15 years ago, I had to write a paper on global warming. So 15 years ago, global warming was the hot topic. Even then, I had to read a book by Stuart Wirt, and it was entitled I forget, something global warming. So I wrote a paper on that, and I actually included some of what I used in the first page of your notes. I didn't tie it into climate change, but I put it in there, my analysis of some of this. So continuing on in your notes, we are on page 3. We've discussed capital letter A. We talked about number 1. We talked about number 2. Now we're going to move on to number 3, the scientific data. So, as I stated, climate change is a subject of debate in terms of just people are talking about it, discussion. It's publicized. It's something that is addressed even in politics. So, what is the scientific data? The historical temperature data suggests, this is what scientists say, the historical temperature data suggests there is climate change, but the crux of the issue is precisely how much, if any, does human activities contribute to climate change? So that's really the debate. How much does human activity contribute to climate change? Number 4 on your outline, scientific theory. Climate change advocates contend that the burning of fossil fuels, think of oil, gas, coal, that these fossil fuels, they increase carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions, and these CO2 emissions contribute to the greenhouse effect, in which the higher CO2 levels in the atmosphere trap heat, warming the planet. This temperature increase may lead to unpredictable weather patterns. And the example that's given is the melting of the polar ice caps will increase atmospheric condensation and precipitation, likely leading to an ice age. Climatologists acknowledge the climate system is climatologists acknowledge the climate system is complex with cycles of cooling and warming. So there's this constant cycle of cooling and warming. And what I've done is I've kind of condensed what the science is saying. And again, I'm not a climatologist. I'm not a climate scientist. Again, I am a philosopher and theologian. That's what I am. So I'm just kind of summarizing what the scientists are saying. All right, so number 5 in your outline, scientific analysis. The various global circulation models that project climate change are predicated on certain assumptions. Climate scientist Dr. Scafetta argues most models overstate climate sensitivity in the rising of the surface temperatures compared to the empirical temperature data. He suggests that the evidence favors climate sensitivity to be negligible and tolerable, requiring adaptation rather than extreme mitigation measures. So his take, as far as I understand, is the climate change, the alarmists, the people that are saying, the world's gonna end. We need to right now change everything about our country in order to ensure that our carbon footprint is reduced and that we're able to reduce pollution and they advocate reducing the population, stop eating cows. All of these different measures, which we would take are extreme. This particular climate scientist says that we don't need to take extreme measures. We need to adapt instead of mitigate. That's what this particular gentleman seems to suggest, this particular scientist. Now, like I stated, so Dr. Scafetta, he contributed to a book that was published by the Cornwall Alliance, giving you full disclosure here. And so the Cornwall Alliance think tank, they question the magnitude, rate, and risks of climate change, okay? So that needs to be up front. But just to make this point, there is no neutrality when it comes to science. We mentioned that last week. There is no such thing as a neutral observer or an observer without a bias. We all have a prejudicial bias when it comes to evidence. we take our pre-theoretical commitments to the scientific data when we interpret data. So we take our beliefs, we take our background data, and we apply it when we do science, right? And I mentioned that last week. So in this particular case, what I've done is I've taken two astrophysicists. So an astrophysicist is not a climatologist, but it is related, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to take two astrophysicists. So I'm going to take a young Earth creationist and an old Earth creationist. Okay? Make it fair here. And they both have the same discipline. And they both address climate change. So the first one I'm going to take is Dr. Jason Lisle. So Dr. Jason Lisle. Okay, and then the second one is going to be who I already cited earlier, Hugh Ross. Both of these gentlemen have doctorates in astrophysics. So we're going to take Jason Lisle and Hugh Ross and kind of compare and contrast their views. And the reason why I'm doing this is because they are from the same discipline, okay? And they both have knowledge of climatology, the study of the climate. It is related to astrophysics. Okay, so Dr. Jason Lisle, he argues the empirical data for climate change caused by human industry is a minimal percentage, if any, compared to the ocean and clouds. So Dr. Lisle is skeptical of what the climate alarmists are saying. He says that, you know what, humans may contribute to climate change, but it is minimal. It is not going to be, the magnitude in which it contributes is minimal. It's not like what the climate science alarmists are saying. And so Dr. Lisle says, we just need to adapt. We don't need to mitigate. So he's skeptical of climate change, at least the way that people that make it sound like the world is about to end. Okay, he's like, no, it's not. Get over yourself. Trust in the Lord. We're not contributing that much to it. We are contributing something to it, but not as much as people are saying. That's my impression. I put the lecture down in your notes, so if you want to listen to Dr. Lisle's lecture on that, you can listen to it. The lecture is entitled Debunking the Climate Change Myth, and it's at fortisplus.org, and it's free, so you can listen to it. Okay, so you can listen to his lecture on it or talk. Now we move on to Dr. Ross. Dr. Ross is less skeptical as Dr. Lisle, but he is definitely not. He is not like the left-wing people that I mentioned earlier. So let's read Dr. Ross. So Dr. Ross says, he argues that the empirical temperature data from paleoclimatologists is indicative of climate change, which requires reasonable and practical mitigation measures. Dr. Ross suggests providing alternative, so here's ways that he wants to address it. So Dr. Ross is actually going to propose ways that we can address climate change without saying, you know what, we need to pass the Green Deal, and we need to stop automobiles, and we need to stop eating cows, and some of these draconian measures that these alarmists are trying to advocate. Dr. Hugh Ross says something that I think his methods seem more reasonable. So this is what Dr. Ross proposes. He says, we should provide alternative fuel sources, namely kerosene, to Africans in the Sahara Desert to deter stripping vegetation, because the stripping vegetation of the Sahara Desert causes CO2 levels to increase. That's what Dr. Ross argues. And so he says that we should encourage Africans in the Sahara Desert to deter stripping vegetation by giving them fuel that they can use, because the Africans are harvesting the Sahara Desert for fuel. And so what we should do, whether, not necessarily America, but all countries, is try and encourage the Africans by giving them cheap fuel like kerosene that has a lower CO2 impact to use that instead of harvesting the vegetation of the Sahara Desert. And then he proposes to incentivize replanting vegetation in the Sahara Desert. And that will help deter CO2 emissions. And then he advocates that the planting vegetation of the Sahara Desert would have a big impact in removing CO2 emissions. Dr. Ross advocates the use of natural gas, methane, rather than coal. This would provide cheap fuel while reducing black carbon soot, which is a known catalyst for climate change and harmful pollution. So China needs to stop using coal and start using natural gas like methane. And if they would do that, then the carbon soot would not be making deposits in Canada, affecting Canada. See the reasoning here? And the reason why the black soot is a problem in Canada is because the climate is so sensitive that it goes through a state of warming and cooling that if you heat up Canada, it can actually cause an ice age. That's what Dr. Ross says. Now, I don't know. I'm not a scientist, okay? But I'm telling you what Dr. Ross argues here. All right, Dr. Ross argues we should pursue thorium nuclear power instead of uranium nuclear power because it is a safer and cheaper alternative. It doesn't have the same effects. I guess uranium nuclear, it has a longer, I don't know what the terminology is, but it takes a lot longer for the radiation to dissipate. Whereas thorium nuclear does not. It only takes maybe 80 years versus 200 years or something. Look into it, okay? I'm not very familiar with nuclear energy. But Dr. Ross argues that we should take up thorium nuclear power instead of uranium nuclear power. And then he argues that lumbering the rainforests by harvesting old trees and replanting young trees, he argues that we should do that. This will replace old trees with younger trees, which absorb substantially more CO2. That's an interesting point. So in some sense, think of this, environmentalists are like, don't cut down this really old tree, okay? But they're actually refuting themselves when they do that because Dr. Ross is saying that what we should do is cut down the really old trees because they're the ones that are actually not absorbing the CO2, or they're not absorbing it, as far as I understand. And instead, what we should be doing is we should be cutting down the old trees and planting younger ones because they absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere. So if you start thinking about that, this seems to kind of, in some sense, go against the environmentalists. So that's an interesting point. Okay, so I've kind of given you these two different perspectives. I'm not going to resolve the issue here on what perspective we should take, but I kind of, not necessarily in jest, but on number 6, I put the scientific consensus. There is no scientific consensus. This is still debated, okay? There is always going to be the possibility that the scientific consensus could change in the future, right? Because there are absolutes in science, but science is often in a position of tentativeness because of what I discussed last week. That paradigms can shift, that there can be a discovery that can change the scientific establishment, the scientific consensus. And so it's plausible that there could be in the future something that can change the scientific consensus. And so what I said here is both Dr. Lisle and Dr. Ross agree humans may contribute to climate change in some way. And again, Dr. Lisle is skeptical how much. So in some sense, he thinks it's very low. And then Dr. Ross thinks we do contribute not substantially to the point where we need to think that the world is about to end, but he thinks that we can take reasonable steps to lower the CO2 in the atmosphere. and lower climate change. So I said here in your notes, that we can address climate change no matter how much you think, if you think it's marginal, or if you think it's maximal, however you, or in the middle, a modest amount, wherever you are on this, where you think the climate change, how much you think we contribute to it. I think Dr. Lau thinks it's marginal, and then Dr. Ross thinks it's modest, how much we contribute as humans to climate change. But they seem to be in agreement that it's not like the alarmists who think that it's maximal to the point that our lives are that we're going to die. In 5 years, like Al Gore said, the world is going to end and we're going to be in trouble. It doesn't sound like that, okay? I don't think either one of these gentlemen are advocating that. And so I put in your notes that we can take steps to address climate change without taking draconian measures. And I think that Dr. Ross gives the most reasonable steps that governments could take, which is very different than what you hear from the different climate accords that our governments get together annually to talk about climate change. It seems like for them, I just heard recently that they're going to have a climate change seminar or convention in Brazil. And so what are they going to do? They're going to harvest, check this out, they're going to harvest the Amazon rainforest in order to be able to have this climate change meeting. Now talk about, isn't that absurd? Why are you going to have it in Brazil and then you're going to have them harvest the rainforest to have I don't know if it's a convention or some type of, I look into it, guys. I just mentioned it, that to me, it doesn't sound like those that are in the government, and again, government representation, they're not scientists. They're government representatives. That's like me. If I'm a government representative, you can't trust me to do a good job adequately to address science if I'm not a scientist, right? Now, if I consult good scientists, that might help me in legislation. But if I'm not a scientist, I feel like I'm going to be inadequate to address the issue. Maybe you can disagree with me on that. Maybe you do. All right, continuing on in your notes, guys. So I put down the scientific consensus. I doubt that there is really a scientific consensus, but between these two views, I really do like Hugh Ross's recommendations only because they're kind of thinking outside of the box. They're creative problem solving, which I'm drawn by. But you guys do your own research, make up your own mind on climate change. But I will say, from my perspective, because of the theological foundations that we've established earlier, that God is in control, that He is conserving all things, and that He is constraining all things, we can trust, as it says in Genesis chapter 8, that seed time and harvest, God is in control, and He will continually provide, because He is providentially in control, and He is providing and protecting His creation to bring about the consummation of all things, to restore the world to the way it should be. So that's going to conclude. Any comments? Go ahead. One at a time. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, so I mentioned about coal. That came from Dr. Hugh Ross. And so he has a book called Weathering Climate Change, and he also has a whole bunch of free lectures online. So if you want to, I can get you those lectures if you're curious to hear what he has to say about he talks about, in my notes I put it here, he talks about black carbon soot and how specifically like China burns a lot of coal. And so it migrates to Canada, and then Canada gets to suffer the effects of the black carbon soot. And it does change the temperature in Canada. But like I said, Dr. Ross says that the black carbon soot, as a pollutant, what it actually does is it not only traps heat to cause the ice to melt, but what happens is when you have a whole bunch of ice that melts quickly, the condensation and the precipitation goes into the atmosphere, and it could cause an ice age. So I'm not familiar with that. Again, I'm not a scientist, but that might be something to look at. And I can get you his lectures if you're curious, because that's something to consider.
My question or comment with this is back when you were talking about that evangelical environmental network. I'm concerned with all that you're talking about. Yes, the importance of the environment, but how it's actually going to affect the church. Because when you have that individual that went to that university and taught, how they were able to teach, so like it's infiltrating the church. And when you think about like foundational issues that, whatever's really foundational and most churches agree on, and then as you get down to secondary, tertiary things, then it starts causing a split. Can this possibly also affect the church the same way, where it's like, oh, you go to that church, well, they're like really on the environmental side, or they're struggling. Or this church is like somewhere in the center. And is it going to cause?
Could it cause division? I don't think we're at the point where within the church we have like a strong tie towards environmentalism to the point where we think, that we're climate activists out on the streets. Because I think that we're grounded in Scripture, and so we intuitively know that God is in control. That doesn't excuse our requirement to take good care of God's creation. We are called towards stewardship to take care of the earth. And that's why I think we should, earlier in my notes, if we're going to exploit, and I use that term in a good way, exploit creation, we need to try and restore what we exploit. So if we cut down a tree to build a house, we should take steps to try and plant more, right? Because we're not affecting just us, we're also affecting our future generations. Because we don't know when Christ is going to return. And because of that, we should anticipate that we're going to be here a lot longer, because we don't know, right? Maybe, Christ is going to be back tomorrow, and that's possible. But until Christ returns, we are going to do well with what God has given us and has entrusted us with, which is creation. But yes, I think it can, Demetrius, to go back, I think it could divide.
Yeah, being, grounded in Scripture, you can have the focus to be on being good stewards, like you mentioned. Yeah. But then you have folks that are environmentalists, that it's more loving the creation more than the creator. It's not grounded in what we believe in.
Right.
And so it just seems like that's going to continue to escalate and be very divisive, not just necessarily in the evangelical church or the church in general, but just also within our society, where
it's polarizing, right? It's like Mirism, like it's polarizing. You're either right or you're wrong, right? That's kind of how it is. It's either, and this is more extreme than this, because this is trying to be more academic, where there's kind of degrees in terms of how we can approach this, whereas what you're citing is, this is a categorical issue instead of a degree or threshold, or I guess threshold wouldn't be the right term, instead of like a quality versus quantity type situation, right? Whereas I'm saying, there's quantity versus quality, and you're right, some people can take it to the extreme, and what we want to do is we want to mitigate that. We want to say, no. We have to have a biblical theological foundation to this before we can approach it. And what happens is people take the science and they don't inform their understanding of science with some of the philosophy of science that I talked about. And so they take it as the gospel truth, that the world is going to end soon by climate change, and so we need to get out there and we need to push legislation to change everything. Or what's going to happen is we're going to end up in a mass situation where we're going to lead to extinction. And what I'm saying is that is completely against what Scripture teaches, number one. And then number two, the science when you understand the philosophy of science, which we addressed last week, you can't take such an absolute stance on that because science is not infallible. And so we need to be tentative on these types of science is about plausibility and probabilities. That doesn't mean to say that there are not absolutes. There are. I gave you some last week. But that is to say we need to be careful. We look at the scientific data, what is the preponderance of evidence, and then we make a decision. But that evidence can be completely overturned by additional evidence that is outside the scope of what we currently know. Yeah. Go ahead, Luis.
Yeah, Brian, just, and you know this, anything can be a source of division in a church. Why? Because man's heart is sinful. Even as Christians, we struggle with our flesh. And when something, when we have a temptation to allow convictions to supersede our priority of the gospel, priority of scripture. And, we've seen, we even had just a recent history of that in our own country, well, across the world, with COVID. We let, people have, people in churches had a strong conviction about one or the other. But it was, it's like, how did we, Christians forgot that, hey, our priority is the church, being the church. Our priority as a church is the gospel and what the Bible teaches, and ministering to that. So Dimitri, the temptation for man to allow convictions to supersede our priorities in the church is always there. And so that's why, and that's why we have to be on guard for that. It's our proclivity, because that's who we are as man. So just to affirm, it will always be a temptation, but for churches that, hey, we're going to sit, what does the Bible teach about our priority? We're going to stick to that.
Yeah, I forget who the quote is from, but there's a saying that in essentials, unity, and in non-essentials, diversity. And that's where we need to take that into consideration. We should triage our doctrines. So on the essentials, they're top priority. You need to affirm it, right? So that would be the doctrine of the Trinity, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, the fact that he has two natures, the doctrine of sin, right? The doctrine of Christ's redemption for us. Whereas non-essentials are going to be things like Calvinism or Arminianism. We can have a diversity of views on that. You're still within the kingdom. Whether you're John Wesley or Jonathan Edwards, you're in the kingdom. But this might fall under non-essentials, where you understand the scientific data leads to. So we can't make that we can't turn a conviction into a gospel issue, because if we do, then we're going against what Scripture teaches, right? Because these are gospel issues, essentials. You're going to either go to heaven or you're going to hell. Whereas these non-essentials, you're in the kingdom, but you might be in error or you might not be, right? Because I think John Wesley and our Arminian brothers, I think they're mistaken, but I don't think they're going to hell. I just think they're mistaken. Yeah. For all my Nazarene friends that are listening. All right. So we started late, so if it's okay, I want to finish the last sections. There's only 2 pages to cover. I want to finish it because the next lecture we're going to deal with abortion. So an abortion is related to what we're going to talk about next, which is animal rights. Animal rights. Okay, so when I studied environmental ethics 15 years ago, I studied environmental ethics. So I had to read this guy. His name was Tom Regan. Tom Regan argued, and it kind of goes back to what Peter Singer says. So Peter Singer argues, who's a famous Australian ethicist, Peter Singer argues that to say that humans are exceptional above any other non-human animal is called speciesism. It's like racism. So Peter Singer says, you can't say that because we are no different than the chimpanzee or the giraffe or the dolphin. We are no different. We're all animals. And so Peter Singer says, we're all equal. Now, Tom Regan, he takes that, he says, you know what? Because of the fact that we're all equal, humans should respect the rights of animals. The animals have the right to life. And therefore, because animals have the right to life, you should not be putting a lobster into the water and turning up the heat and letting it boil and die. He says all animals have the right to life. Now this goes back to what we talked about when we talked about how we can understand specific ethical principles. And one of those ethical principles was rights. And we talked about our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Hamilton, and how they talk about we think about the Declaration of Independence, that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then John Locke says property, right? We talked about this. The right to life.